My name is Esme Thornton, and for most of my life, I believed silence was the only way to keep a family together. I learned early that love in our house was something you earned, by being agreeable, by never questioning, by staying small enough not to cast a shadow. Every time I tried to speak, my mother's smile tightened, my father's voice cooled, and I swallowed the words before they turned into something they could use against me. I kept their secrets. I defended their name. I stayed quiet when they needed someone to blame. But that morning, when I walked into the courtroom and saw them sitting across the aisle, pretending I was the disgrace they had to endure, I felt something break cleanly inside me. Not rage, not even shock, just the quiet certainty that I would never bow my head to them again. They still think this will end the way every story in our family does, with me apologizing for existing. They have no idea how wrong they are. That morning, the rain over Savannah felt heavier than usual, as if it wanted to wash away everything left unsaid. I stepped out of the car with a folder pressed tight against my chest. The air was thick, and the water slid cold beneath my collar. Each step on the courthouse stairs echoed like the slow, hollow thud of a heart bracing for impact. When the courtroom doors opened, they were already there. Robert Thornton, tall, polished, his silver hair combed to perfection. Evelyn Thornton, draped in black silk, sunglasses still on indoors, as if even the light might betray her expression. They didn't have to speak. Their silence was sharper than any insult. The message in their eyes was clear. I was the blemish they'd tried so hard to hide. My mother leaned toward me, just enough to let the whisper cut deep. "You came dressed for court? That's adorable." My father chuckled, low and dismissive. "Let's hope she doesn't embarrass herself again." I stayed quiet. I'd long learned that silence was the only language they couldn't twist. Then Judge Richard Carrington lifted his head. His pen froze midair, eyes flickering with a flash of recognition. And something else. Memory. 3 years ago, I had stood before him defending a man who died behind bars. Arthur Bellamy, my mentor, had sat in the back row that day, proud and steady. Now I stood before Carrington again, not as an advocate, but as the accused. Case 24-165. Robert and Evelyn Thornton versus Esme Thornton. Coercion and undue influence over the deceased Judge Arthur Bellamy. The room fell silent. I gripped the strap of my bag, the only anchor left between my shaking and my resolve. Outside, the rain kept falling, and in that moment, I understood. This wasn't about money. It was a trial between blood and truth, between justice performed and justice earned. I grew up in a house where everything gleamed, except the truth. Our white brick home by the Savannah River looked perfect from the street. Every frame, every polished silver trophy, every award on the wall was proof of what we pretended to be. My father, Robert Thornton, loved to say that a Thornton didn't fight in court. We owned it. My mother, Evelyn, made that illusion shine. She threw charity galas and smiled for society pages, her voice soft as honey and twice as fake. Behind closed doors, her laughter cut sharper than glass. I was their only child, though I often felt more like furniture than flesh, something useful only when the house needed to look complete. At 24, I broke the first rule of being a Thornton. I chose principle over prestige. I turned down my father's offer to join the family firm and accepted a position as a public defender. He didn't look up from his whiskey when I told him. "Public defense," he muttered. "That's charity, not law." My mother smiled that practiced smile. "Some people join the law to be powerful, others to be pitiful." I remember her voice more than her words, the kind that makes you feel smaller without ever needing to raise its pitch. I said nothing. From that day, I stopped using the Thornton name on any legal filing. It wasn't rebellion. It was survival. 6 years later, I met Arthur Bellamy, a retired judge who'd lost his seat after refusing a corporate bribe. The legal world labeled him difficult. I thought he was the first honest man I'd ever met. During our first conversation, He asked why I defended people the world already decided were guilty, because no one defended me when they decided I wasn't enough. I said. He smiled. And that was the beginning. From then on, he was sir to me, and I was kiddo to him. Weekends became our quiet ritual. I'd drive to his cottage on Tybee Island, where the sea wind carried salt through every open window. We'd edit his old case notes, drink Earl Grey, and tend to the white roses he planted for his late wife. Sometimes, when the tide was calm, he'd say, "White roses don't bloom for applause. Neither should justice." I thought it was just something wise men said to make their regrets sound noble, until the day he was gone, and the world clapped for all the wrong reasons. Arthur died that winter in his favorite chair, the one by the window overlooking the ocean. The air still smelled of tea and paper when I arrived. A single white rose bent over a half-empty cup. A week later, his lawyer read his will. The Tybee Island house and a $3.1 million trust, the Bellamy Fund, were left in my care to train lawyers who chose integrity over convenience. It didn't feel like an inheritance. It felt like a vow. Then came the headlines. Young lawyer inherits fortune from retired judge she once worked under. By evening, the phone rang. My mother's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "You let that old man manipulate you. You've humiliated us." "He didn't manipulate me," I said quietly. "He raised me." The line went dead. 3 days later, a knock at the door. A courier handed me an envelope, rain bleeding through the edges. Plaintiffs, Robert and Evelyn Thornton. Defendant, Esme Thornton. Attorney, George Maddox. The name froze me. Arthur once told me about Maddox, an ambitious attorney he'd fired for falsifying evidence to protect the same corporations my father represented. And suddenly, everything fit. My father wanted to shield his reputation. Maddox wanted revenge, and my mother wanted to erase the stain of a daughter who refused to perform. I sat in the dark, watching the rain crawl down the glass. For the first time, I understood what it felt like to have blood and justice turn their backs on you at once. Then Arthur's voice came to me again, steady as the tide. "Don't fight for comfort, Esme. Fight because someone has to." I placed the summons on the table, brushed away the rain, and whispered into the quiet room. "All right, sir, let's fight." The door had opened, and what waited beyond it wasn't just a trial. It was the reckoning he always knew would come. And maybe, even in death, Arthur Bellamy was still teaching me how to stand. The summons lay on my desk like a wound that refused to close. I kept reading it, though my eyes always froze on the same 4 words: undue influence case. Once, I'd stood in court to defend people no one believed in. Now I was the one accused of manipulation, of deceiving the only man who had ever trusted me. By dawn, my name was everywhere. Local defender inherits millions, accused of exploiting retired judge. An old graduation photo surfaced online, rain-soaked hair, tired eyes, and beneath it, the comments piled up. "She's playing the victim." By noon, the public defender's office had sent its verdict in one clean sentence: administrative leave, pending investigation. No one called, no one asked. The silence hit harder than the accusation. That evening, Maya Lynn called. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the tension. "I checked Bellamy's medical file," she said. "The attending physician, Raymond Holtz, died 2 years ago." "They used a dead doctor to sign the report?" "Yes, filed by Maddox's firm." The air thickened, sharp as salt. A false record meant the case wasn't just about me. It was about erasing what Arthur stood for. I turned on the lamp, light pooling over an old photo of us by the rose bushes. His voice echoed in memory. "Don't fight for comfort, Esme. Fight because someone has to." 3 days later, Maya called again. "I found an old corruption case from 10 years ago." Arthur presided. "The defendant was your father." My pulse stuttered. She added quietly, "He hid your father's name from the record. He protected him." Outside, Savannah's rain poured down, streaking the glass like ink rewriting history. I drove to Tybee Island the next morning. The sea stretched gray and endless. Arthur's cottage stood still, the air thick with tea and thyme. His desk was covered in papers, and under the fourth creaking board, I found a wooden box, wrapped in brittle tape. The handwriting across it read, "If they come for you, let the sea speak." Inside were a letter, a USB, and the faint scent of salt. They'll say I lost my mind, but I haven't. I left you this, not because you asked, but because you never did. On the screen, Arthur's frail voice trembled. Robert Thornton once stood in my courtroom. I stayed silent to protect his name. It was my greatest mistake. Don't repeat it. Esme, let the sea carry the truth. The storm broke outside. Waves crashed against the house as if demanding to be heard. I opened the last folder inside the box. Bank transfers from Thornton and Pierce to Maddox Legal Research. My hands shook, but my mind was clear. They had all built their fortunes on a lie. And now, the sea would speak for me. The morning of the first hearing, Savannah felt staged, as if the whole city had been cast in someone else's play. Reporters filled the courthouse steps, lenses glinting under a pale sky. My parents stepped out of their car hand in hand, every movement rehearsed. They looked like the grieving parents America was supposed to love. Her in a black dress and pearls, head bowed just enough for the cameras to catch a perfect tear. I could almost hear her voice repeating the line she'd practiced all week. "We only pray our daughter remembers who raised her." I waited at the back entrance, where the rain had left streaks down the stone wall. Maya stood beside me, her hands in her coat pockets. "You ready to play quiet fire, counselor?" she murmured. I shook my head. No, just truth. Inside, the courtroom was colder than I remembered. Judge Carrington sat high above, scanning the room. When his gaze met mine, his pen froze midair. "Ms. Thornton," he said softly. "We meet again." The ripple of whispers that followed was almost physical. Then Maddox stood, sharp and theatrical. My clients were robbed, not of money, but of affection. This woman preyed upon a dying man's trust. He held up a folder like it contained scripture. "This medical record will show Judge Bellamy was mentally unfit when he signed his will." I rose slowly. "Your exhibit is fraudulent. That state seal was retired in 2017. A silence dropped like a curtain. Carrington frowned, scanned the document, and struck his gavel once. "Withdraw the exhibit, counselor." The blow landed harder than any argument. My mother leaned toward my father, whispering something that made her lips tremble. During recess, Carrington crossed the hall toward me. His voice was low, roughened by age. "You remind me of him." "Arthur?" I asked. He nodded. "He wrote to me once, warned that if anyone ever challenged his will, the name Esme Thornton would carry the truth." The letter never arrived. That night, Maya sent a message. She'd traced Maddox's firm to a recent request. 2 months earlier, someone had accessed sealed letters from the probate archive. The missing correspondence. I didn't need her to finish the sentence. Maddox had it. The real letter? I sat on the living room floor, the laptop's glow casting shadows across the wall. I played Arthur's old video again. His voice filled the quiet. "Don't let them turn silence into guilt," I whispered back. "I won't, sir." By the second day, the courthouse was suffocating. The steps outside were packed with cameras, headlines screaming in the wind. Judge's protege turns defendant. Thornton family fights for honor. I walked past the swarm without a word. Inside, Maddox played a televised interview, an anonymous source claiming I'd had an unhealthy emotional dependence on Arthur. The room erupted in whispers. Carrington slammed the gavel for order. I stood to respond. "Your Honor, I request this hearsay be stricken." I paused. Let the moment hang. Correction. I am my own client. I presented an email from the court's digital archive, the scanned copy of Arthur's missing letter. "This confirms Judge Bellamy made 2 wills, one public, one sealed to protect me from interference." Carrington studied it in silence, then nodded once. Maddox lunged forward. Digital files can be forged. Where's the original, Ms. Thornton? I met his eyes. Ask your conscience. The murmur that followed was louder than any ruling. Later that afternoon, Maya met me at a small cafe near the bridge. She slid an envelope across the table. I hacked the notary database. The clerk who certified Maddox's medical file, David Morse, was fired 3 years ago for evidence tampering. He now works for Thornton and Pierce, my father's firm. The pieces clicked together. Maya leaned in. What now? I stared out toward the river, the current dark and fast. We let the sea speak. That night, I returned to Tybee Island. The moon was low, the air thick with salt. I replayed Arthur's files and found a second hidden video. His voice, frail but certain, filled the room. If you're seeing this, Esme, you're fighting the ones I once protected. The truth isn't in documents, it's in hearts. Let the tide expose them. I sent both videos and every financial record to the FBI under one subject line. Evidence. Title 18. Public Trust Violation. By dawn, I was standing again at the courthouse steps. The crowd hushed as I passed. Your Honor, I said when the gavel called us to order. Today, the sea will speak. The final hearing began at 8 sharp. The sky over Savannah was still, too clean, too quiet, like the breath the world takes before it shatters. I walked into the courtroom in my worn navy suit, Maya seated behind me. My parents were already there, unmoved and immaculate, like statues carved from denial. Maddox began his performance, voice polished and venomous. My clients lost not money, but the dignity of family. The defendant preyed on a dying man's weakness. He held up photos of me and Arthur in the garden. My mother turned away, face tight, pretending grief instead of shame. I rose. Your Honor, the defense calls no witness, only one voice. Carrington's eyes narrowed. Proceed! The screen flickered. Arthur appeared, sitting in his old chair, voice trembling but clear. If this is being played, those I once trusted are trying to bury what they could never earn. I gave my house, my trust, my fund to Esme Thornton, not because she asked, but because she never did. Silence fell. Maddox leapt up, shouting, Objection! Overruled! Carrington said flatly. The FBI watermark shone faintly on the screen. It was real. My mother's hand shook. My father's jaw went slack. Carrington looked at me. Anything to add? Only this. Your Honor, justice never dies. It just waits for someone brave enough to lift it again. Outside, the wind rose, and somewhere beyond the courthouse walls, the sea began to speak. An hour later, the courtroom was packed wall to wall. Reporters lined the aisles, cameras poised, their lenses fixed on the golden envelope resting on Judge Carrington's desk. He adjusted his glasses, broke the seal, and began to read aloud, his voice steady but heavy with meaning. To my colleague, Richard Carrington. If this reaches you, it means they've come for her. The only student who still believes justice can breathe without applause. I leave my estate to Esme Thornton, not out of affection, but repentance. Years ago, I protected her father from prosecution. It was my greatest shame. She will pay that debt by living as I could not. Honest. The clicking of cameras echoed through the silence, but no one dared speak. Carrington lifted his head, his tone solemn. This letter is verified, signed, and sealed by Judge Arthur Bellamy under federal authority. The court finds the will valid. All claims of undue influence are dismissed. My mother's sob broke the stillness. She buried her face in trembling hands, while my father sat motionless, staring at his empty palms as if finally realizing what they'd cost him. Maddox gathered his papers and slipped out without a word. Carrington's gavel struck once, case dismissed. The sound reverberated through me like the closing of a long, painful chapter. Outside, reporters crowded the hallway. One shouted, Ms. Thornton, any comment? I met their cameras and said softly, Integrity doesn't need a spotlight. Then I turned away, leaving the noise behind. The only place I wanted to go was Tybee Island, where the sea, at least, would understand. 3 days later, I returned to the house by the sea. The late afternoon sun poured through the thin curtains, scattering ripples of light across the wooden floor. When I opened the window, the air filled with salt and the faint scent of dried roses, the fragrance of forgiveness, quiet and earned. On the desk waited an envelope, neat and unassuming, my mother's handwriting on the front. Inside was a single photograph, me at 8, wearing a paper graduation cap, her hand resting on my shoulder, half holding on, half letting go. There was no letter, only a short line written on the back. "He thought you were better than us?" He was right. I didn't cry. I simply placed the photo inside the wooden box that once held Arthur's letters and wrote on its lid, "Things I've survived." 2 years passed. Now I stood in the federal courtroom in Savannah, not at the defense table, but behind the bench. The plaque before me read, "Hon, Esme Thornton, federal judge." My first case was a young woman accused of manipulating an elderly man for inheritance. Her hands trembled. Her eyes were red, voice small. They said I tricked him, but I didn't. I looked at her and saw my own reflection. "Did you stand by him when no one else did?" She nodded. I returned the gesture. No more words were needed. That evening, I drove back to Tybee. The wind moved gently through the rows of white roses Arthur once planted. On the living room wall hung his wooden plaque, "Justice doesn't retire. It waits for the next hand to lift it." I picked up my pen and wrote beneath it. It has, the sunlight spilled across the words, soft and golden. I sat by the window, listening to the hush of the tide. Justice was no longer something I chased. It lived quietly within me now, steady and deep as the autumn water at Tybee.